Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and we are back. Going to be finishing up Bricky's Every Faction in 40k Explained Part 2. This time we got the Necrons and the Tau. Let's get into it.
The Necrons are spooky, scary skeletons and very grimdark again. They have a much more fleshed out lore than before. Back in the day, they were just undead Egyptian space terminators, and they still look that way, but now they actually have a story. So way back in the day, you had the Necron tier. Kind of see a...
Yeah, when did the Necrons come out in the lore? I'm sort of curious because they seem to be one of the most prominent bad guys of lore in recent years. Though I say bad guys, I think they work together to attempt to stop the fall of Cadia, you know, R.I.P. to the legend. But yeah, I'm curious to know the evolution of the Necrons, the Necron lore by Games Workshop.
The theme here: Eldari, Eldar, Krork, Orc, Necron, Necron tier. So the Necron tier were this race of generally kind of shitty people. Not because they were personally shitty, but because their lives were awful. They were ill-fated to a horrible existence of like radiation and a terrible planet they lived on, and everything just really sucked. Being a Necron tier was just really depressing. They really were looking for immortality. They were extremely reliant on the hope that they would eventually find the key to living forever and just stave off this horrible nature that they were thrust upon them, and therefore
I'm always curious about that because, you know, in evolution, creatures get more refined to their environment over time. Now, I guess it's true that evolution doesn't select for happiness or satisfaction, but it definitely selects for creatures that thrive in the exact environment that they're in. So maybe the Necron tier evolved in a planet that was less irradiated, maybe greener or wetter or more lush, and then the planet's climate shifted, creating a species that could like barely survive, couldn't withstand the radiation on their own planet. Maybe something like that. Again, lore experts, I look to you. But I hear this stuff and I think to myself, that's not really how evolution usually goes. Again, or maybe it's just the Necron tier of just angry, frustrated people, and that you can make the same case about human beings, right? We live for, you know, a couple of decades, and then we get all these horrible diseases, and then we die.
Therefore, they could become the most dominant race in the galaxy. And they found this group. They're called the Old Ones. Imagine them kind of like the Forerunners in Halo or the Xel'Naga in StarCraft, right? These Old Ones were these strong, pretty much...
Okay, I don't think GW stole this. This is something out of Lovecraft, right? The ancient, long gone race that built everything great. What's sort of interesting, to me at least, is that I hear that and I think of a lot of ancient civilizations actually, but the one I'm most familiar with is the Aztec and Mayan civilizations, where the Aztec Empire, right, that was the one that existed, that reached its zenith prior to the colonization in like the 1700s, knew of the location of the ruins in another city, Teotihuacan. I'm sorry for the pronunciation. And Teotihuacan was not built by the Aztecs, but it was a huge ancient site that was, you know, almost 1,000 years old when the Aztecs first came upon it. And they just sort of said, this must have been built by gods. Ancient gods, far older than us. And that's just sort of what they defaulted to, because they're like, if we didn't build this, then who knows who did, right? Because the idea of recording history, right, over really long periods of time is both hard to do and not that common. Even our modern scholarly work, you know, we're always learning new stuff about histories that weren't even really all that long ago.
Omnipotent beings, and they of course knew the key to immortality. So the Necrons went to them and said, please show us your ways. And the Old Ones said, piss off. Not really, they were a lot more humble about it, but they did not want to share their secret of immortality with the Necrons. The Necrons, of course, took this very well and waged war with them, kind of under this united banner. The Necron different dynasties didn't really like each other, but under this one man, the Silent King, he thought the best way to unite his race was to do this giant war with the Old Ones out of spite for them keeping the secret of immortality to them. This was known as the War in Heaven.
I mean, it's like a trope in political science that anytime you have domestic conflict at home, you can always find an enemy abroad to help bring people together under your banner. And it's probably a human instinct, taking us all the way back to our tribal days. The idea that when you're under threat, human beings collectively rally around their imperfect but strong, or a leader that appears strong, in order to combat that threat. Again, evolutionarily makes a lot of sense, right? You don't want, the more threatening your environment is or feels, the more you want to be able to operate with social unity and social cohesion to respond to that threat. So you look at the Necrons, and I mean, that makes social sense, right? And logical sense too.
And this is actually like a multi-stage war, because during this war in heaven, they discovered the star gods, a whole new race of people known as the Catan, or the Catan. These star gods were also very much like Old Ones, almost omnipotent beings, and they too had the key to immortality. And so the Necrons went to them and said, hey, can you help us fight off the Old Ones? Can you help us kill these Old Ones, you, the Catan? And the Catan said yes, and in fact, we can help provide you with the immortality you so desperately seek. So the
other classic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I'm assuming he's not getting into this, but based on how well fleshed out the rest of the lore is, I imagine that the Satan and the Old Ones probably didn't get along. They were probably two competing, ethereal, immortal super beings. But again, throughout history, we can see that politics makes unlikely bedfellows, and certainly that's true in warfare. The classic being, of course, the staunchly anti-communist United States and the staunchly communist USSR teaming up to fight Germany in the Second World War. That, of course, and then immediately after the World War, they went back to hating each other. But it's funny how just necessity can just make you rethink all of your historic assumptions about who your enemy really is.
The Silent King of the Necrons decided to make a pact with the Catan to allow them to accept this generous gift of immortality upon them. But this, of course, had been a horrendous trap, and the Necrons were dragged in chains to this biotransference where their flesh was stripped from them, replaced with nothing but a metal hollow shell, as their souls were ripped from their body and fed to the Catan. And the Catan fattened up. They got chonk on the souls of the Necrons. As this was their plan all along, they consumed the flesh and souls of the Necron tier and turned them all into unwilling robotic slaves just to serve their will. And then, with their new-founded Necron army, they pointed their guns at the Old Ones, and the Catan continued their domination of the stars and their genocide, complete and full genocide of these Old Ones. The Old Ones did their best to stave it off. They even created other races, the Eldari and the Orcs, to try to fight off the horrifying Necron army and the Catan above them. But there was absolutely no possible change.
What is interesting too, the other classic historic example that we think of countries empowering a dangerous or risky group or country and then having it turn around and bite them is, I mean, it happens throughout history. But again, my thoughts, the first one that I think of is, of course, the U.S. funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in '79, and sort of tried to prop up a pro-communist Afghan government. And of course, the U.S. funded a local resistance against Soviet occupation, and it funded them, trained them, equipped them. And of course, the result was that the Soviets took a ton of casualties and ended up withdrawing from Afghanistan about a decade later. And the problem is that that same group was now well-funded, well-trained, and very organized and experienced. And of course, they turned their guns on the West. And we know how that played out. It also, of course, played out in the Second World War, where the former French colonial holdings of what was then Indochina was invaded and conquered by the Japanese, where a large local resistance of Vietnamese took up arms to fight against Japan. They successfully kicked Japan out of the country, and then the French came back expecting to resume their colonial rule, and the Vietnamese fought against the French, and then fought against the Americans who tried to intervene. So the Vietnamese independence movement can again trace its origins back to a country funding and creating an armed force to do its bidding, and then having that armed force turn around and bite them back.
For them. And the old ones were absolutely extinguished across the galaxy. Their entire race completely removed. Full-on 100% genocide. However, during all this, the C'tan, so just infatuated with their victory, started fighting each other for fun, for sport, and for small differences, doesn't matter. The C'tan, with these overpowered people, they're going to eventually hit each other at some point. And as they began just menially fighting each other, the Eldari and the Orcs actually started pushing on the C'tan's borders a little bit, giving them a little bit of a run for their money. And as this continued, this is when
I really need to do more research on the War in Heaven, because why would a disembodied star god have borders?
Silent King, who retained his consciousness, decided to leap into action and start a full-scale revolt against their C'tan masters. And this revolt was bloody, as the entire Necron army was surged off to destroy these star gods. They were able to, just after suffering horrendous losses, were able to turn the tide of the war. And they took these C'tan and they blasted them. Because as these star gods are unkillable, they were able to break them into thousands of shards and entrap them in giant stasis vaults to now actually be slaves to the Necrons. And with the Necrons having the entirety of their old gods enslaved to them, they realized that soon their race was about to be attacked by the overcoming new races, the Eldari and the Krorks. And so what they did is they retreated into giant stasis tombs in order to preserve their energy and their strength for when one day they would be reawakened and they would be able to rule the galaxy that was rightfully theirs. And then some dingus Adeptus Mechanicus guy diddled with a green console, and now the Necrons are back and they see all these primitive races on their lawns and they think, get the fuck off of it. The Necrons are back.
We've all been there, bro. We've all been there. Yeah, it's always funny to see how even countries, right, in the modern world have this sense of their neighbors being theirs. The classic one is, of course, the United States and their sense of Latin America as our backyard, and them being very resentful of other countries trying to attempt to exert large-scale influence over Latin American countries, or specifically Central American countries. You also have countries like Russia that try and often succeed in exerting heavy influence over countries around their border, like Belarus, Georgia, Ukraine. So it's interesting to see how just some countries really, again, like the Necrons, resent the idea of other countries that are supposed to be their vassal states exerting their independence or even just sort of existing.
Back, super advanced, and they are here to reclaim the galaxy that they so rightfully believe is theirs. Now, at tabletop, they're a lot like that. Tons of undead Egyptian skeleton robots that when they die, they just get right back up because they keep on reanimating. Hard to kill, tons of crazy stuff. You can use the Catan themselves as units to fight with. It's pretty cool. The Necrons are one of the three major events in 40k. The Horus Heresy, the Fall of the Eldar, and the Awakening of the Necrons are all pretty substantial events. And the Necrons themselves...
Oof, I'd probably put the Fall of Acadia and the Tearing of the Galaxy into up there. But that's recent, right? That was actually post-dated to this video. So, yeah, because this was April of this year. So, maybe it wasn't. Anyway, lore experts, let me know when they rolled out the official, like, Guilliman is back, the galaxy is cleaved in two, Cadia's fallen. I really think that was before this video came out, though.
Are pretty dang cool as well. Here's a good quote from a wonderful Dawn of War game. Lucky creatures, as long last you have found the tranquility of death. I was like you once, clinging to life and blind to the truth. When I uncovered the truth, I too shuddered and paled with fear. Deep in these catacombs I was remade. Here my brethren slumbered for eons while the living grew like weed. My Lord knew this day would come. He had plans for us all. We would purge this world once more. So come, poor victims of life. We will grant you tranquility in these crypts. Kronos will be a tomb world once more. Necrons are also pretty smug. Trazen the Infinite especially, a little dickhead. But speaking of dickheads, last race. Let's...
Yeah, I've also heard The Infinite and Divine. Major Kill swears up and down. One of the best books he's ever read. But Major Kill's... He seems like a nice guy. I'm just going to tease. He seems like a bro. I mean, literally one of his videos is him in a bro tank with his own name on it. But I'll give any book a chance because, you know, I've been trying to read this examination of Russian foreign policy in the Ukraine for months. And, of course, it's about as exciting as it sounds. So, next up, once there's a paperback version, I will happily read The Infinite and the Divine. Also, if you have any other top-tier Warhammer books, man, let me know in the comments. Also, I was sort of toying with the idea of doing like a live stream book club or something, where like every week I read a chapter and we talk about it on the stream. I don't know. Let me know if you guys like the concept.
Let's talk the Tau.
We made a fucking walkie.
The exact formation of the Tau Empire is not entirely understood. However, a long time ago, many thousands of years ago, in the 40k world that is, some Imperial navigation vessels were going around through different areas, and they saw a primitive race, blue people, smacking each other with sticks and stones. They thought, dumb Xenos race, who gives a shit, and they bailed. Then this giant warp storm occurred right in that major area, unable to be breached. Then, once that warp storm 6,000 years later subsided, hello, those little sticks. Well, they decided to actually have no war of any kind and all just unite together under one flag of the Tau Empire. And now they have gigantic starships and Gundam robots and lasers and railguns and mechs, and they are here to ruin your day for the greater good.
I do have a weakness for any giant walking mech. And the Tau, yeah, I kind of see it, right? They got, I mean, literally that looks like something straight out of an anime.
That is generally the Tau Empire. They have this kind of feeling of this homogenous group. All species can go underneath the banner of the greater good. The greater good is their idea of the fundamental increase and help of all. In fact, they are most likely the most like the Covenant in Halo, where they have the overarching prophets, being the ethereals, who are actually kind of dicks and like to pull at strings a little bit, but then you have all these different races directly underneath them, and they all work together in this big group as this large, foreboding race that tries to spread their weirdly pseudo-religious influence across the galaxy. The alien is not...
So, yeah, when I look at the Tau, I'm always struck by the fact that, one, the greater good, that greater social utilitarianism does have a lot of, well, it has a lot of dirty history in the world, right, where you have leaders who try to look at the big picture of their country and decide that for the health of the country, certain types of people need to be eliminated, certain types of industries need to be relocated or reapportioned, certain types of even cities in some cases. The Khmer Rouge is a classic example where their revolutionary leader wanted to turn Cambodia into an agrarian utopia. But of course, it's hard to do when you have cities. And so the Khmer Rouge decided they were going to just burn the cities to the ground and kill anyone who resisted, or just kill anyone. And it was pretty horrific. You see similar things in Mao's big push for collectivization. Also, the Soviet Union did the same thing, where there was an intense famine, but it was seen as being, instead of mitigating it, it was seen as being necessary to promote the greater good for their nations and to establish the utopian vision of their leader. Of course, the utopian visions almost never get realized, and all you've done is killed a bunch of people for what turns out to be no reason. But we don't need to worry about that so much. I'm sure the Tau have it figured out. Okay, there's one other thing that bothers me, but I'll get to that in a second.
Not intrinsically evil. Do not hate him. Pity him, his ignorance. Seek to understand his differences and equate him with his inadequacies. Only then will he accept his place in the greater good. That is generally the Tau.
Yeah, the Tau also strike me as the term I've heard recently is Tau chauvinists. And that just means someone who believes that they, whatever their group is, are intrinsically superior and have a natural right to lord over others. And that quote right there tells me, sounds a lot like a Tau chauvinist, right? That's the idea that the Tau are acquainted with the best organization to a society. They have the best way of communicating. Their language is the best. Their culture is the best, is the most refined, is the most advanced, is the most good, virtuous, if you will, just. And that the other races they encounter can be a part of it, but they will always do so from 4 or 5 steps behind, right? They'll never really catch up to the Tau society's perfect level of justice or refinement. So you can be a human world and join the Tau Empire, but you will never have a human ethereal. You will never even have probably a human high-ranking commander, right? Are there any humans that, or other races that command Tau on the battlefield? Or is it always a Tau commander with subordinate units that can include other races, right? Because to me, that would be the number one indicator that the Tau are actually sort of like Tau supremacists, is the idea that, yes, a human can play with us, but because of their primitive human society and their primitive human beliefs, they could never rise to become a commander of a Tau legion or a unit or commanders of Tau, period. Certainly would never become a leader of the Tau. And I know the Tau have these like very rigid caste systems, so if you're not born into it, you will never really, like, no one born into the earth caste will ever rise to or never become a member of the air caste, etc. But yeah, it's still, I don't know, man, there's something about it that definitely gives me Tau supremacy vibes. Again, let me know, commenters, if this is disproven in lore.
And if you're kind of wondering like what their mainly big shtick is, well, they're all about big robots and mechs. They have laser rifles and rail guns. They got giant mechs with tons of missile pods and heavy rail rifles and rail guns and burst cannons and ion accelerators and void shields and all this stuff. And that is generally what the Tau's all about. But you're probably thinking, Bricky, this doesn't sound that evil. This doesn't sound very grim, dark Warhammer. And you'd be right. The Tau Empire really don't have that much of a horrifying, grim, dark style like everybody else. They're much more younger, new age thing. In fact, they're probably a lot less evil and a lot even better than they are now back in the day because they liked having like that good guy faction. But a lot of us who really like the dark, depressing style of Warhammer didn't really like it that much. So, see, the Tau get a lot of hate, and a lot of that hate isn't necessarily...
The Tau are really engage in some pretty coercive practices. That it sort of appears like perhaps the Tau and their ethereal cast are actually like mind controlling everyone to surrender their individual will or to give them a compulsion towards the greater good, and that it has some pretty strongly coercive vibes to it. In fact, I think that's the Farsight Enclave's concept, right? That we had this Commander Farsight who got disconnected from his ethereal somehow and realized that the ethereals probably were engaged in some level of mind control, compelling everyone to serve the Tau Empire in the interest of the greater good. And again, like we talked about, that whole greater good, especially when it's a small number of individuals who are deciding what constitutes the greater good for the many, it has produced so many horrific outcomes that it seems like, to me, only a matter of time before the Tau start to really do some like pretty grimdark stuff. And I think it would be a great turn to have a group that has the best veneer of respectability, but is in fact one of the worst.
Fairly unjustified. It's mainly from a tabletop perspective, but as you can see from all the visuals I've shown you recently, they don't really fit in the 40k universe very well. They lack that super dark, dramatic, kind of high gothic level the Imperium has. They don't have the weird kind of like grungy stuff that Chaos or say the Orcs do. And the Necrons and the Eldar have their own specific style as well. The Tau really do look like something out of Gundam. And while it isn't necessarily a bad thing, it does definitely not fit too well. There's that.
I gotta say, I feel like I see that, and I think they should be... You've got such an opportunity, if you haven't already, at reveal the Tau as just being, like, horrific. Like, willing to, like, starve a planet to death to divert a food shipment to a military operation. Right? That's the kind of shit that you would see. That would be classic, greater good, like, horrific outcome type stuff. Right? Or to just, like, forcibly feed huge parts of your empire to a Tyranid invasion just to divert them towards your enemy. To just be like, oh, we're going to have 100 Tau worlds just get eaten. We just don't care. We're actually going to lure the Tyranids to these worlds in the hopes that they will run themselves into, say, an Imperium military sector. That's the kind of greater good stuff that as someone who loves military history, that's what I would expect from a society that's set up with a small number of people determining what constitutes the greater good and sort of coercing others to go along with it. So I'm curious if they've started adding that into lore or if it's not something that's shown up. I'm going to say shown up yet because, again, I think the potential for a really polished, good guy, good image faction, it just everything in my real world experience tells me that this slick, idealized image is hiding something just as horrific or more so.
There's also the tabletop problem. In tabletop, Tau are horrible at melee combat, but exceptionally good at range combat. So they blast everyone from really, really far away, and they have a million rules to make it so that it's nearly impossible for you to get into melee combat. So it basically just forces you to bottleneck the game into one specific gameplay style, which is gun to gun. And if you're doing gun to gun, they're going to win every time, because they're the Tau, and the Tau are really damn good at shooting. So it's one of those things that make the Tau generally rather hated, and a lot of different reasons for that, both from style and such. But this is actually one of the things I wanted to end this video with, is that the Tau, while they have their issues, you should not be discouraged from playing them. I'll make plenty of Tau weeaboo jokes, of course I will, but it's all generally in good fun. Anyone who legitimately doesn't want you to play a faction is an idiot, and you shouldn't be giving them the time of day. You pick what you think is cool and what you like. In Warhammer...
I really like that. You know, I think in especially a fandom like Warhammer, right? And I think Warhammer, one of the things that I like a lot about the fandom is that it selects for a really specific type of person, right? Someone who has, I mean, the energy and focus to meticulously and lovingly paint these models, to understand the lore and history behind them, and then to play a game with them that's a little strategy and a little luck and kind of math heavy. And so I think you select for people that enjoy intellectualizing things. Obviously, you see this channel, right? This is I like to believe the smartest React channel on YouTube. And I don't think I could, I don't think if I was doing this level of analysis of like Fortnite or, Minecraft, that I would have more than 100 views, right? Because nobody cares. And I think when you have this fandom that really, really enjoys the intellectualizing and the philosophizing and the thinking hard about it, that you end up with the risk that people stake out these intellectual positions like the chair of a department who did research in the 70s and is like, this is the defining thing of my field, and the evidence mounts decade after decade that they're wrong, and they just don't ever let go of their position, right? Because they're too emotionally invested in it. And I think it's a really healthy perspective to just say, listen, at the end of the day, this is a hobby that, it's a super healthy hobby, right? Again, compared to drinking or smoking, or even other hobbies like motorcycles or boating that are like incredibly expensive, in the grand scheme of things, miniatures and their paint isn't the end of the world. Warhammer's, I think, a pretty healthy outlet, right? And so, but I think we have to keep in mind, this is ultimately just painting figurines and then having mock battles with them. So, and I think I'm glad Bricky is saying it, right? Because I try to keep that perspective too, even as someone who's obviously enjoys analyzing and perhaps over-analyzing Warhammer 40k. I think it's really, really important to remember that, like, this is a game, and it's a game that, people are going to come into in all different ways, right? Somewhere, maybe on this channel, is a 14-year-old who's like, wow, I want to buy my first Indominus box, and I can't wait to paint my Tau robots because they look cool. I think they look cool. I think it'd be fun to paint them. And, like, you should do that. If you're that person, dude, this fandom's for you. Somewhere there's a 65-year-old guy who's like, I haven't gone out in a year, and maybe I'll play this painting miniature game. Or maybe you just like the lore, right? It's a great hobby for that reason, but it's easy to fall into the trap of having these, like, intellectual beliefs that you, like, cling to and then try to impose on others, when ultimately they should just come into the hobby however they like to.
Especially now, factions get better and they get worse. They grow and then they fall. You should only be playing what you think is cool. You like the look, you like the models. If you're talking tabletop, that is what you should be going for every time, is what you think is badass, because things change all the time. But the universe of Warhammer has so much going for it. Every faction has something interesting. Every character has a story, and there's a million stories to be told. The universe is vast and exciting, and while it is dark, depressing, and horrible, that is the damn charm. And out of everything I've told you in these two videos, if anything you can take away is the reason why so many of us are so into this series and why we like it so much. Because with so much variety, such an expansive universe, and so much that can be done, you can find yourself having a pretty great time. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it has been informative to you.
Yeah, I think that was a great ending by Bricky. That's a great perspective. And you just heard me cover the same thing, so I won't belabor it. But what I will belabor is my new merch. I have new merch. Obviously, I can't wear it because it's still not coming in yet. but you should check it out. I've got the link down below. You should be able to see it, and I think it's really fun and it's cool. And you know, I because of work stuff, I had to close out the Patreon. So merch is the #1 way to support the channel. So thank you guys again, and I will see you guys next time.